Okay, excellent. Welcome everyone to this Institution of Environmental Sciences webinar, Achieving Net Zero, a Future Without Coal. This webinar is being held in collaboration with the Geological Society and is part of the Geological Society's series of activities around COP26 and the role of geoscience in decarbonisation, and also part of the IES's stages on the road to COP26 work. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Julian Allwood. Julian is Professor of Engineering and the Environment at the University of Cambridge. He initially developed his academic career at Imperial College and from 2000 has been in Cambridge. In parallel with developing new manufacturing technologies for metals, he has built up a research group looking at environmental systems and production. From 2009 to 2013, he held an EPSRC Leadership Fellowship to explore material efficiency as a climate mitigation strategy, delivering material services with less new material. So thank you very much for joining us, Julian, and for presenting today. To all our attendees, it's great to see you here. After Julian's presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and these will then be read out on your behalf during the Q&A session. You'll also have the option to raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question yourself. Just to let you know that this webinar is also being recorded and will be made available on YouTube after today. So thank you very much for logging in, and I'll now hand over to Julian. Thanks, Julian.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining. It's a pleasure to be here. When I was originally invited to this event, I was invited to join a panel talking about coal, which sounded all right. It turned out the rest of the panel took fright, which was, I think, lacks courage. So I have the whole session to myself, and I don't know enough about coal to fill it. So I've extended the title, and I hope that's all right, to talk about coal in the context of the Rhetoric Action Gap on climate mitigation, where I feel I'm slightly better informed. We have got through phony War 1 on climate mitigation, which was the war about climate skepticism. For a long time, then people were able to get more attention than they deserved in the press with climate skepticism. And I think that ended roughly in 2007 with the IPCC's Nobel Prize winning assessment report number 4. And certainly it had ended everywhere apart from on Fox News in America by the time of the Paris Agreement. So I think we're pretty much agreed now that climate change is real and we have to act on it. But unfortunately, we've immediately switched into phony war number 2, which is very definitely dominant now. And that is the idea that techno-optimism is the solution. New technology is going to solve the problem. This is a problem of economics. All we need is the right incentives. New technologies will emerge. And by existing innovation mechanisms, we're going to invent new ideas and make money out of them. Don't worry, it's just that you have to try harder. That's the only thing that we need. And that's where we're at the moment. And boy, is it having no effect. So here is the history of global emissions since we started talking about them. And here are all of the big international meetings, and the famous ones, obviously the COP26 is the one coming up at the moment. There've really only been 2 noticeable dips in this graph. One during the financial crisis in 2008 and one last year with the lockdown, but don't worry, we're on track to get our emissions back to their previous rising trajectory as we forget about lockdown. However, climate optimism, techno-optimism is the rhetoric of the day. Here is an American with great hair and teeth in saying earlier this year, don't worry, 50% of the reductions we're going to make in emissions by 2050 will come from technologies that don't yet exist. And that is the story that every new political group who has signed up to climate mitigation has said, we'll invent our way out of it, and on the way we'll get rich. To underline that point, here is another American with great hair and teeth in 2007 saying, don't worry, technology will get us out of the hole. So there was a period in between when, due to having different governments, the Americans lost interest in the issue. But the rhetoric has not changed. It's still that new technology is going to solve it for us. Here's how we're getting on. The UK government is very keen to point out that our GDP has grown while our emissions have fallen, and they're trying to link that to technology developments. But I'm afraid that is rubbish. Since we started recording our emissions in 1990, no new technology has had any significant effect in the UK's emissions history. The red line is the emissions that we report to the United Nations under the terms of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The blue line is what we should have reported if we accounted for our spending rather than what happened. Obviously, one of the big impacts the UK has had on global emissions is to shift them elsewhere, because if they're in a foreign country, they're not real. And the green line is what would have happened if we hadn't taken any action at all. That's my calculation. So looking at the graph, you can see that underlying our emissions in transport, buildings and farming are essentially untouched over the 25 years of this graph. And you know that because if you look out of the window, you can see that the cars traveling past you are bigger and bigger every year. In fact, the average weight of cars on the road has gone up every single year on this graph. Internal temperatures have also risen, and there's been no meaningful change in our farming practices. We have reduced our industrial emissions by shifting things overseas. Our successes there are primarily the closure of our plastics production, but we've also done really well in closing steel production over that time. Our consumption of both materials has gone up. The thing that we've done really well is capturing methane in landfill management, and we've reduced our methane emissions by about 70%. That's a success. But the big story, as we all know, is Mrs. Thatcher's policy of converting from coal to gas-powered electricity generation. So we've virtually eliminated coal until the gas prices went up and we started using it again. An interesting set of priorities there. But that's what's been the major driver of our emissions reduction. So if I look between the blue line of what we really caused and the green line of where we would have been if we hadn't acted, coal to gas is the big story. And the others are landfill management, so the capturing of methane, and some effect from growing our offshore wind generation and our solar farms as well. No new technology has taken any part there. Wind was already a mature industry in Denmark in the 1970s. So let's do a brief survey of the rhetoric of today. How are we going to deal with climate mitigation as we move from now to zero emissions in 2050? Well, it's pretty clear from the Climate Change Committee. Here is their advice in the so-called balanced net zero pathway. And you can see that they're promising that we'll get there with a set of wedges. Reducing demand for energy and efficiency will have a small effect. Electrification is important, but the really big story is hydrogen, CCS, and negative emissions technologies. If I extract out of that the fundamental resources they're planning to draw on, you can see that because hydrogen doesn't exist in any native form, and neither do negative emissions technologies, then what the Climate Change Committee is hoping is that we'll solve the problem primarily by non-emitting electricity, negative emissions technologies, and biomass. Well, if you then look at the translation of that into the government's 10-point plan, which is their current rhetoric on what they're going to do about it, then here are their current ambitions. And again, if I reorder them a bit, you can see they're drawing on exactly the same resources as the Climate Change Committee. So the question is, have we got enough of these to make the plan look credible? Given that the corporate rhetoric is saying almost the same thing, but adding to it the magic of offsets. So I chose three high-emitting companies here. I have no personal agenda against these three. I think if I'd chosen any other high-emitting large corporate, I'd have found the same story. I've picked out in red the means they're going to deliver on their ambitious rhetoric to be net zero by 2050. They're going to do offsetting, biomass, hydrogen, capturing and storing, offsetting, hydrogen, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So let's have a quick look at those four key weapons: biomass, negative emissions, hydrogen, and carbon capture and offsets. Biomass, as you will know better than me, grows slowly. So here is the UK Forestry Commission's current model of the rate at which a hectare of forest would absorb carbon, expressed as the total amount of carbon stored in the forest. So here's some initial planting, and over a period of about 50 years, a forest grows, but with very little effect in the first 10 years, obviously, because at that stage the trees are saplings with a very small leaf area. It's only when they develop their full canopy that they develop their full carbon absorption potential. So grey biomass does take CO2 out of the atmosphere, but it does it pretty slowly. However, that isn't the main problem. The main problem is the conservation biologists telling us that humans are already appropriating an unacceptable high fraction of the world's total harvest or net primary productivity. And I think every biologist I've talked to tells me that there is no possibility that the human species should appropriate any more biomass on our journey to zero emissions because of the catastrophic impact that has on other habitats. So although biomass might, in theory, be a zero emissions compatible material, we can only use it if we use it by substituting other current human uses. We can't expand the total human use of biomass. What about negative emissions? Well, Bill Gates, whose book is a triumphant call for the techno-optimist, says, you might find it strange that I fly around in private jets while talking about climate change, but don't worry, I'm paying for negative emissions to take the emissions out of the atmosphere. So that means something like this set of fans powered by renewables that purify the air and take out of it pure carbon dioxide and store it permanently. Well, for those of you who remember any of your physics learning when you're at university, you'll know that the second law of thermodynamics tells you that if you're going to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, the amount of energy required to do that must always be greater than the amount of energy you gained when you burnt the fossil fuel to release the CO2 in the first place. And this is an extraordinarily inefficient process for the very obvious reason that with a concentration of 450 to 500 parts per million, you've got to pump a lot of air through in order to get the CO2 out. And then you've got to store it in some way, either as a solid, which takes further energy, or by compressing and chilling it and pumping it underground. So if you have spare non-emitting electricity to power this process, but anywhere on the planet, anybody is generating electricity by any other means, it would always be better not to do this, but to use your spare electricity to replace fossil fuel powered generation. Well, don't worry, the techno-optimists have their solution to this. We can keep burning fossil fuels if we do something rather British, take the features that we don't like and sweep them under the carpet. So carbon capture and storage has been the abracadabra white hope of climate policy for at least 20 years. If you go back to the International Energy Agency's policy proposals on climate change from 2001, you'll see that they're confidently predicting that at least a quarter of anthropogenic emissions will be captured and stored using CCS by 2050. And all that it requires is that 10 large demonstrator plants are initiated in the next 10 years. And they have repeated that statement every year since, just moving the dates forwards. We have currently got no large demonstrators of CCS. There are about 17 projects which apply it to get more oil out of the ground. And there's no way that we can take that as being a contribution to reducing emissions. It's increasing the supply of fossil fuel. There are a couple of sites in Norway which use it to replace flaring of gases during extraction, and only 2 projects in the world which attempt to apply it to small power stations and actually sequester the CO2. So it's made almost no progress, despite the enormous lobby of the oil and gas industry who fund the Global CCS Institute to produce the most extraordinarily optimistic descriptions of how CCS is going to contribute in the future. I picked out this graph just to show on the y-axis the current capacity of global carbon capture and storage. Remember, the big scale number here is 140, but the red numbers are the ones that are actually operating. So the largest one there is 40. But this is capacity, not actually capture and storage. The industry doesn't tell us how much of the capacity or what the load factor is. Let's assume it's a half, given that they're not giving us the information. So that would say that current capture and storage is of the order of 20, but the units are million tons per year, and current human emissions in the same units are 50,000 million tons per year. So if I put the total effect of carbon capture and storage on a graph of human caused emissions, you can see that it hasn't left the y-axis, the x-axis at all. It's still in effect zero. So maybe this will emerge, but it's been around for so long and hasn't emerged. I think a rational approach should be to say it's an interesting idea, but it should have no place in policy whatsoever, because we just aren't deploying it at a serious rate. Unfortunately, the possibility that it might exist is used as an excuse for not acting on all the other things that we might do about emissions. So carbon capture and storage is currently holding us back in delivering real mitigation. Hydrogen is the next abracadabra word, and as you know, you can make hydrogen from methane, as we do at the moment, which causes emissions to be released. Potentially that could be captured, but there is no carbon capture and storage around at any scale. Potentially it could be made by electrolysis, but only if you had spare non-emitting electricity. If you do have spare non-emitting electricity, would you use it to make hydrogen? Well, here's the amount of electricity you need, for example, to power a hydrogen car compared to powering a battery car. You need 3 times more because the round trip efficiency of hydrogen is so poor. If you're heating your house with hydrogen, it's 6 times more electricity. And if you're making steel, it's 7 times more. So hydrogen is not the magic solution it's being touted at. It radically increases electricity demand until either we have a massive supply of non-emitting electricity spare, or a massive supply of unused carbon capture and storage waiting for carbon to be generated. Then hydrogen isn't going to have any significant effect. So finally, what about offsets? Well, under the phrase voluntary carbon markets, they've been given new credibility. But if you think about the timeline of an offset, the goal is that somebody releases emissions. Let's say if somebody flies, we'll say it's a return flight to New York, and they feel guilty about it. So they pay for some notional offset, which after some delay for management or planting or whatever it is, usually leads to a slight increase in emissions due to the capital project of building new equipment or disturbing the soil to plant things. And then at some rate, the offset removes emissions from the atmosphere. Well, all well and good, and eventually, potentially, that might reduce the emissions by as much as the initial release increased them. However, we're now committed to net zero by 2050. So it no longer matters that the offset pays off eventually, it matters that the offset pays off by 2050. And you can see that each year that passes gives us less time for that to occur. So therefore, the offset has to be applied at greater and greater scale if it's to be compatible with net zero. We've just submitted a paper with some analysis of that to show that if you account for the timeline, if you try and enforce the idea that the offset should pay back before 2050, then whatever mechanism you choose, whatever offset you use, the scale and therefore the price grows faster than exponentially as we approach 2050 because of this delay until things occur, and therefore the increased scale at which you have to make the offset, you have to apply it. So all of these offsets are massively more expensive than those being offered for flying at the moment. They can only possibly be compatible with net zero for a short period longer. And given the expense, it would be far better to use that money to stimulate markets for alternatives rather than to pretend, rather like with the Catholic Church's sale of medieval indulgences, that we can keep emitting because we're rich and we'll solve the problem somewhere else. So that adds up to rather bad news. The corporate rhetoric is based on offsetting, but that's virtually impossible. Biomass, we can't use anymore. Hydrogen, but we can't make it because we haven't got any carbon capture and storage or sufficient spare electricity, and CCS and offsets and so on. So there is a massive gap. The rhetoric is not currently compatible with what we can possibly do. You might wonder what's missing. How is the political dialogue going so wrong to allow these discussions to carry on? And I think it's really for three things that are being overlooked in current political rhetoric. Above everything, I feel this is something that we need to educate journalists about so that they don't allow politicians or corporates to make these statements unchallenged. There are three things that are being overlooked. The first thing is aggregation, adding up the total demand being made on the three fundamental zero emissions resources. There are really only three resources that matter as we move to an emissions-free world: negative emissions technologies, biomass, and non-emitting electricity. And here is, on the right-hand side, the Climate Change Committee's forecast of what the UK needs. You can see they're forecasting that we need 4 times more non-emitting electricity than we have at the moment. I think it's possible to imagine that we might get there. That we need more biomass than we have here, and I don't believe that's possible unless we release it, for example, by stopping eating ruminants to release the area of agricultural land that was previously used for growing fodder. But look at the negative emissions. We currently have 0, and yet the Climate Change Committee is forecasting that we will be able to draw on a massive amount. That's a crazy prediction. Until we have some, at least, of it, then anticipating it can scale in such a major way is committing us to a very, very uncertain, risky future. The second thing that's being missed is deployment rates. You'll have seen over the weekend that the government is trickling the idea that they're going to announce a new nuclear power station. Well, here's the story of Hinkley Point C. From when the government committed to having Hinkley Point C, the project has followed the purple timeline. It's currently about 16 years after that point. And if it's delivered on time, as we currently predict, then it will have taken about 22 years to appear. But we can anticipate it's probably going to be late. So the government's announcements this weekend that it might soon commit to a new power station, maybe that's a good thing, but it isn't going to have any effect till the 2040s. It's not going to be contributing to any of our emissions targets before then. Even the pro-industry lobby, the International Atomic Energy Authority, says that it will take a minimum of 12 years from commitment to delivering a new power station. So a commitment now has no impact on our 2030 targets, the ones that are in our nationally determined contribution pledged to COP26 at the end of the month. And it's almost certain that they won't have any effect on our 2035 targets when the government is saying we'll have reduced our emissions by 78% from 1990. Offshore wind, you could think we can build wind turbines faster, and we can using manufacturing facilities, but installing them is a big project. And here is the Hornsea 2 project, the big offshore wind farm that should be commissioned this year. That would have taken 16 years from when the policy commitment was made, and the industry predicts that it would have taken 13 years. So even now, new offshore wind farms announced now are unlikely to be operating before 2035. Deployment rates are missing in the political dialogue. And the third thing that's missing is a sense of risk. And I put on this graph 2 forms of risk. The one on the right is the risk about whether different approaches will arise. So I've plotted technological risk on the x-axis, and you can see that all of our political and corporate rhetoric is in high technology risk, low behavior change area. It's always pilloried by politicians that you can't have behavior change because nobody's going to wear a hair shirt, as if that was the only other option. But the technology and behavior aren't a set of binary switches. They're the 2 ends of a spectrum. And in the middle of them is what I've called the missing obvious, which is using today's technologies differently. Every year since we signed the Climate Change Act, our cars have got heavier, and they're now 12.5 times heavier than the people inside them. So almost all of the petrol and diesel being used in the UK is to move metal, not to move people. That isn't part of the United Nations Charter on Human Rights. We could drive small, slower cars and still live excellent, high-quality lifestyles. The graph on the left is preliminary, and I was slightly hesitant when the Institute asked if we could record this because we haven't published that. And I don't want to defend it yet until we've gone through more rounds of review. But it's the first result from one of my students who's working on trying to predict societal collapse as a result of climate change. Global warming is too cozy a phrase. It sounds attractive in the UK. Maybe we won't have to fly to Spain in order to lie in rows on disgusting beaches getting sunburnt. We could do it in chroma instead. But the real effect of global warming is starvation. So this is a projection of the world's population normalized to the 2000 population. The blue line is the famous World 3 model used in the limits to growth work in the 1970s, which so far has proved quite accurate, although it hasn't yet reached its peak, as you can see here in the 2040s. Based on it, my students' work has been to take IPCC models of temperature forecasts, to use them in crop productivity models linked to socioeconomic projections of buying power in countries to work out when each country in the world will no longer be able to either grow or purchase enough food to sustain its population. And you can see the terrifying result here is that the first major collapse is in Africa in the next decade, followed by an enormous collapse in Oceania here, and then collapses in other areas within the lifespan of everybody younger than me. So that is, I don't want to defend the predictions, the numerical predictions here, but that graph, the story it tells, is what we're actually talking about when we're talking about climate change. We're talking about starvation, uncontrollable migration and war, and that rather than global warming is what we should be thinking about. And it isn't being factored into the way that we evaluate rhetoric, because we're simply not accounting for the risk of jeopardy, the end of our economy due to unmitigated climate change. So we are currently in the second phony war of techno-optimism that's preventing us acting on climate mitigation. It will end, and it will end either because we become so frightened of catastrophe that we want change, or maybe, and I hope, our financial institutions will become aware of the risk to our futures. Anybody under the age of 39 saving for a pension is hoping to receive income on investments now beyond the age of 2050. And therefore investments in, for example, fossil sectors, the sunset sectors of the fossil era, whether it's aviation or fuel or whatever, combustion engine manufacture, those sectors have to close. They're currently overvalued, and maybe that will be a sufficient driver of change. Where we're eventually going to get to is reality, not a marginal change in the economy, a structural change in the economy. We don't know if it'll be bigger or smaller because it's going to be quite different, but we can prosper within it, we can live well, but we'll live with specific different changes in our lifestyle. So let's have a quick look at that. When we become real, dealing with climate change involves stopping emissions. That's pretty straightforward, and here are where they come from. Roughly a quarter are the combustion engines used for transport. A quarter are the combustion engines used for electricity generation. A quarter are the combustion for heat and chemical processes of the industrial sector. And roughly a quarter are the way that we manage land, whether to do with forestation, growing crops, growing ruminants, or the decomposition of biological waste. So we have to stop all of those things. And if you want to reduce this to a set of simple public messages, then at home, anybody who's interested in this should be swapping their fossil car for an electric car, their fossil boiler for an electric heat pump, stop using fossil planes, and stop eating beef, lamb, and dairy. Those are the things that we control from our homes. At work, we can influence the way that we choose to build buildings. We shouldn't be doing any further building. The way that we source materials and any other fossil uses in freight or other industrial equipment. And you can see the calls for policy as well. This reality is missing from public dialogue at the moment due to the fantasy about new technologies. In the UK Fires Consortium, which I lead, a 6-university £5 million project for 5 years, trying to look at the reality of placing zero emissions at the heart of future industrial strategy. we, in 2019, decided to try and give this flesh by writing a description of how we would actually mitigate emissions in the UK if we were going to do it with technologies that we know work, that are already commercially available today. So our ground rules were all energy will be non-emitting electricity, we can't expand our use of biomass, and there'll be no negative emissions technologies. It doesn't seem to me a very radical set of assumptions, but it's far out compared to any other policy proposal on the table today. We wrote the report Absolute Zero describing that. And what it means is that if we take our history of non-emitting electricity generation up to now, which you can see here, it was a straight line in the last decade. Let's assume that straight line grows. And we get to an amount of non-emitting electricity, which is not that far off the amount projected by the Climate Change Committee. And we're not quite on track for it at the moment, but we're not far off if the government delivers on its commitment to quadruple offshore wind by 2030. We'll be close to being on that line. If we electrify everything that we currently power by other means, then our total demand for electricity will be up here, and this will give us around about 60% of what we need. We've looked at that and it's quite okay. We can live well with 60% of the electricity by taking radical personality denying steps like driving smaller cars or insulating our homes better. So we know that there are things that we can do there. But there are 4 things which we have to stop because we have no substitutes for them. And those are ruminants. If you look at this emissions per serving of food, you can see how lamb and beef completely dwarf everything else. Flying, we don't have the resources to make any alternatives to kerosene because of the shortage of biomass and non-emitting electricity. Shipping has the same problem. And actually the really hard one is cement. I could include blast furnace steel here, but we can replace blast furnace steel with recycled steel. There are currently no options on the table anywhere for making cement with no emissions. If I compare our forecast with that of the Climate Change Committee, then you can see there's a key difference. We're assuming that there are no negative emissions and we can't expand biomass. As I say, I don't think that's a very radical assumption. It seems to me purely rational, but the consequence of it is that we have to have a great deal more efficiency. And the efficiency here is not in the motor or in the heater, it's in the system. Smaller, lighter cars, not magically more efficient motors. In substituting, finding different ways of doing things, public transport instead of private transport and so on, and in restraint, not flying, not using cement. So that's a real pathway to zero emissions. And of course, we're now working on putting out the policy proposals that would be compatible with that. Okay, now, given that this was advertised as a talk about coal, the big use of coal is for electricity generation. And if you rule out carbon capture and storage, which currently is the only rational thing to do, it's an interesting technology we need to gain experience of, but until there are 10 large plants operating, then it has no place in policy whatsoever. So that means that we have to rule out coal in electricity generation. The other major use of coal is in steel. So what are they up to in the steel industry? Well, obviously, you can imagine they're taking it very seriously by talking about it. What they've built is a single demonstrator plant of steel making linked to carbon capture and storage in Abu Dhabi. It's a good thing. It's a pilot study and we want to gain experience of it. It's linked to enhanced extraction of natural gas. So it's a carbon negative approach at the moment. It causes more emissions because it gets more gas out of the ground. And there is no independent verification of the figures being produced from this tiny pilot plant. That is the only carbon capture and storage enabled steel plant in the world at the moment. Now don't worry, the steel industry is going to convert to hydrogen. They're completely convinced that saying hydrogen is the same as saying abracadabra and a new steel industry will emerge. Well, the only pilot plant for that is being developed in Sweden by the Hybrid, under the banner of Hybrid by SSAB in Sweden. And they're building a pilot plant that may begin industrial operation after 2040. And they're absolutely honest about it on their website, saying fossil-free electricity is the key. It takes 7 times more electricity to make to make steel from iron ore using hydrogen than it does to do it by recycling. And here is the evidence that they produce. So it's completely honest. It doesn't make any sense until we have an excess supply of non-emitting electricity, and we don't, and it won't happen for a long time. So there are lots of other options that have been described, particularly due to the ULCOS, the ultra-low carbon steel making project that ran in Europe in the beginning of this millennium, but they are all for lower emissions rather than zero, and our targets are all rightly now focused solely on zero emissions. There are no options on the table for primary steel making with no emissions, but there's good news. If you look at the lifespan of steel products, on average, they last for 35 years. They could last longer because about half of steel is used in construction, and most buildings are taken down not because they're broken, but because the landowner can make more rent from having a different building on the site. But if we track the history of steel making, we know what's been made in the past, that's the upper line here, and we know the lifespan of the product. So therefore the blue area is the amount of scrap steel that we know is going to come back for recycling in the future. In fact, we know it's going to treble in the next 20 to 30 years because we know what's been made in the past. So steel recycling is going to grow. If we look at it in the UK, then our consumption of new steel is this upper blue graph, somewhere between 10 and 15 tons per year. And our scrap arisings are around about 10 million tons per year. But what we currently do is export it for low-grade recycling in other countries. We hardly use any of it in the UK. It could become a very valuable precious resource if we start sorting it and managing it like a proper resource, like a mining company would do. If we control its composition and use it for upcycling. In today's recycling, that doesn't happen. Recycling today puts everything in a basket and blows oxygen through in order to try and purify the melt. And you can see here this sort of mishmash of the periodic table, that doing that allows a large number of elements to go into the slag, some vaporize, but what stays in the metal are some of the alloying elements, and that's a good thing, that adds strength to the steel, tin and copper, and of course iron. Tin is rather localized because it comes in tin-plated food cans, and we can control that scrap stream. But our problem is copper, which leads to hot shortening and surface cracks in the surface of the copper. We've looked at that, and there are lots of options for managing it. And the UK could become the country which innovates to come up with high-quality steel recycling, upcycling, based on the control of copper through all these different interventions that could be made to reduce the copper content of recycled steel. So to try and summarize and wrap up what I've attempted to bring together in the story of coal and rhetoric, the phony war about new technologies is not even started yet. It's a universal belief, and all the people who are negotiating at COP26 will focus on new technologies. I'm afraid it's not true. There is not time, we can't aggregate them, and it's too risky to allow those to happen. Carbon capture and storage is in that bucket. Although some small plants have been operated to get more fossil fuels out of the ground, in reality, it's at such small scale that it's a pilot study only until we've got full-scale gigaton, gigawatt power stations linked to carbon capture and storage operating in several locations. We don't know how the public are going to accept it. Will it go the way of fracking in the UK or nuclear power in Germany, where the public simply say, we don't want to have it? Will there be an accident? Of course there will. People will die from it in the early stages because it's a new complex technology. How will the public react to the first accident? We don't know. We've got to find out. But until we know, we should not be including it in policy because it's stopping us doing the things that actually lead to climate mitigation. Without carbon capture, we cannot have coal in electricity generation, and we can't use coal in steel making. So that means that the future of coal is linked to the future of carbon capture and storage. And given the stage of development we're at, by 2050, we can confidently say there won't be any significant carbon capture and storage, and therefore there can't be any significant use of coal. I think that's probably enough. Let's break off and have some discussion.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Julian. That was a really interesting presentation. Lots of food for thought there. So all the attendees, please do put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question in person. To kick off with, obviously the big thing on the horizon at the moment is COP26 coming up in November. Given what you've talked about there with some of the issues that you've identified in the carbon budget, what would you like to see come out of COP26, and what do you think need to be the key areas of action that nations need to agree on?
It seems to me that a lot of what has to happen is domestic, but there are three things that can't be done by domestic governments. The first one is international aid. The case that China and India are currently making, that they should be allowed fossil fuel use to do economic development and then decarbonize later, isn't justifiable because there isn't the carrying capacity left. But therefore, we need international aid to subsidize their transition, not China, but India's transition to a low carbon economy directly without going through high emitting. The second thing is that the rules of the World Trade Organization are inhibiting the growth of non-emitting industry because any domestic low carbon producer, which naturally will have higher costs as it begins, has to compete with imports from unregulated emitting industry. And that's simply not fit for purpose. And the third thing is that international aviation and shipping fuel is currently untaxed. So flying is 4 times cheaper than it should be, even if it was taxed at the same rate as road travel, but we have to phase it out to 0. So the tax should be higher than that and ramping. So those are the three things that matter. The UK government is going to make a pledge to, or has already made its pledge to reduce UK emissions to, I think, 68% of 1990 levels by 2030. That equates to a 45% cut from 2018, which was the data when they made the announcement. They currently have no plan at all to deliver that, but we've been working on a new version of the Absolute Zero report, which we're publishing this week, which will describe what that actually looks like. You can imagine that given that there's no time to build any new kit between now and 2030, it does involve restraint. Therefore, nobody is going to like every aspect of our plan, but therefore we've got to start talking about it. Otherwise, we're going to be in the very uncomfortable position of seeing our government claim international leadership while proclaiming on the international stage a commitment that they have no intention to deliver. And I would much rather that they had a commitment that they did deliver.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Julian. And one thing personally that I've seen that's missing from the COP26 presidency themes and agenda so far is the concept of circular economy. And given what you were saying about steel and how the current use of coal for making steel is unsustainable and should be phased out, do you think embedding circular economy principles will be a key part of kind of allowing us to carry on with the production of things like steel or the reuse of steel?
I have a major problem with the phrase circular economy because it's become linked with drawing a green circle on your marketing brochure and having your photo taken with a celebrity to indicate that you've found a get out of jail free card. Circular economy is not a goal, it's a potential mechanism to reducing emissions to 0. And that's our goal. Circular economy is not the goal. And you know that as soon as you look at cement, because you can't recycle cement. There are no technologies on offer to do that. Ditto with ceramics, ditto with thermosetting polymers. So the most popular paper written by academics on the circular economy is 114 definitions of a circular economy, which is because they've all realized it's the wrong phrase. Circular economy means bringing things back, recycling, reuse. But that's nothing compared to designing things efficiently, keeping them from longer, and using them more intensively. Those are the things that really matter because they reduce the primary demand for new material production, and they're not remotely captured in the metaphor of circular economy. So I regret the phrase. Of course, conserving material value is a good thing. But what you would really do if you cared about material conservation is keeping things going. I had a student project this year on trying to apply the most rigid definition of a circular economy to a car. And the rule was you can only make the next car out of the atoms of the current car. And I asked the student to try and anticipate the energy and labor consequences of every option for doing that. And it's very clear that you would do your level best never to destroy the car, just permanently to replace, repair, upgrade the components. You would try and avoid recycling at all costs. And circular economy doesn't communicate that critical message.
Oh, thank you. That's a really interesting take. I think a really good thing for people to think about when talking about the circular economy. Thank you. I'll move on to some of the attendee questions. Do you think that population decrease should be a goal to meet climate ambitions?
Yeah, I love that question when it comes up, usually from people from a slightly right-wing perspective. And I don't know the questioner. And my response is always to ask, well, where should we start? Would it be your family to begin with? If we reduce the population, the key is to reduce the number of Americans because they're the highest emitters per capita. The places where population is growing rapidly are in the lowest emitting countries. So in the short to medium term, population control is not the problem. The problem is the middle and wealthy people who are the high consumers, so both high emitters and also the high consumers of meat. Now, of course, I'm overdoing it there. Yes, the total population is too large, we know that, and that's the problem on biomass. But given the timescale of 2050 to get to zero emissions, I can't see how population control is a significant action. Worse than that, the graph I showed you about risk indicates that starvation is going to become a major problem. So I'm very uncomfortable to say it, but it looks like the population is going to go down through disaster rather than through birth control. So I'm sorry, that's a rather complicated answer and from an important question, but one which is very difficult to operationalize.
Thank you. Yes, and I think the point about timescales is an important one when you're talking about population decrease. I'll move on to the next one. How do you envisage the military, who's a huge carbon emitter, will adapt to changes with fuels for planes and ships, etc.?
Yeah, good question. Huge is a word that we have to try and avoid when we're discussing about this. So what fraction of total flights are taken by the military? I don't know that answer. So let's say that they are an emitter, but be cautious about huge because it's a word that gets used so often and causes confusion. The law of the UK doesn't make an exception for the military. So the military is as committed, therefore, by law, as every other aspect of the economy. I have heard word that they are serious about it and talking about trying to make it happen. Presumably the possibility that aerial warfare will become more dominated by drones than large aeroplanes may reduce their total fuel impact. Presumably the fact that nuclear-powered ships or submarines exist might allow for an expansion in other forms of nuclear marine, might be driven by the military. Then maybe there could even be some things that they could lead that could then move into the civil economy afterwards. I don't know, but as we stand, there isn't a get out. And if there were, given the commitment to get to zero emissions, somebody else has got to come up with some negative emissions in order to allow it to happen. And we haven't got any on the table.
Great, thank you. And in terms of using biomass and planting more vegetation, is there a large degree of open, already cleared land where a large amount of trees could be planted globally? Or does further land have to be made absent in order for biomass to make a significant emission reduction?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on all of that data, and there are people who will know that very well. From the analysis that we've done, then deforestation is still occurring because there isn't sufficient land for growing food in places where the population is growing. So for the UK to consider afforestation, it seems to me it can only morally do it on its own arable land. And that's a helpful way of realizing how expensive it is. That could be possible if we release land by eating fewer ruminants. roughly half of all arable production at the moment is fodder for livestock. So as we eat less meat, we can release land and we could grow trees on there. But by my calculations, if we doubled the total forestry area of the UK, then over 50 years, that would capture about 2 years worth of current emissions. So it isn't the kind of big impact that you would like it to have, you'd like it to be. So I think probably the big story about trees is avoiding deforestation rather than hoping that afforestation can be a massive sink.
Great, thank you. I'll try and squeeze in one last question if that's all right with you. We've got a couple coming through, but I'm afraid we won't be able to fit them all in. But one is, obviously you've talked about the techno-optimism, which is very kind of prevalent throughout society, I think, at the moment. Given what you've talked about to get to absolute zero in terms of the behaviour change aspect, how do you actually go about educating the man on the street about these pressing issues and actually supporting this behaviour change?
What the National Citizens Assembly, which ran over a couple of years on climate change, the #1 message of their output was the public want to be involved in the discussion. And at the moment, nobody is telling them what's involved. The government and the large corporates are creating this techno-optimistic smokescreen. So nobody in the public can even be aware of what's big and small in their own life or in the national life that we have to deal with. So I think #1 is to get the information out there so people can at least start having the conversation about it. With behavior change, we just don't know. We don't know what the balance is and when people are going to absorb it, but we do have a reference of lockdown to say that once people are seriously threatened, they can change their behavior very fast. But I think a nice way of thinking of it, or not nice, a rather sort of direct way of thinking of it is thinking of an alcoholic going to see a doctor. Then would you feel that it would be okay if the doctor said, well, look, I can see how difficult it is to stop drinking, so don't worry, invest in research and you'll be able to reconstruct your liver in time. All you need is a new sequestration process and we can build that for the liver. So just keep drinking, don't worry about it. You know, all of us surely would think that was a totally immoral behavior on behalf of the doctor. And yet that's become normal, not just in the government and the corporates, but also with journalists. And I think for me personally, that's the target area I want to work on, is to try and bolster the journalists to ask much, much better questions of the implausible plans being put in front of them.
Great, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Julian. I'm really sorry if I couldn't get to your question. That was a really interesting and informative webinar, and I think it's thrown up a lot of different areas that still need to be discussed, a lot of things we need to think about. So thank you so much for that. Really appreciate your time on it. And thank you to everyone else who attended. I hope you found that as beneficial and informative as I did. If you're an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar on the IES CPD tool. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the IES website and YouTube channel. So thanks once again to Julian, and thank you to the Geological Society. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Thanks.